Hey everyone, and thanks for joining us for another episode of The Bottom Line. I'm your host, Lauren Kalil. As we await for the open leaderboard to be finalized by CrossFit, Tommy Marquez and Brian Friend are here to discuss many questions that ourselves and maybe you're asking as we look back on the three tests from the open. Guys, a lot of changes this year as we looked at the programming and having a second year of just 3 weeks of the open. But let's start with talking about there was no repeat. It's a huge staple in the programming since CrossFit's second open. Brian, let's start with you. What do you think that this really means for the sport?
I mean, it's one thing for the sport, but I think it's a larger issue question of just the methodology in general. One of the things that made CrossFit so, I think, popular and attractive and different early on was that Greg Glassman assigned definitions to terms that had previously been used regularly in the context of exercise, health, fitness, but were never easy to understand or to put into a coherent sentence or explanation. And one of the things that he did was he introduced this idea of observable, measurable, and repeatable testing. That's why we have benchmark workouts. That's why we have hero workouts. And as far as the open goes, that's why ever since the second iteration of the open, there's been a repeat workout there, not just for you or me to test against ourselves, but for the community as a whole to test against themselves. And it doesn't have to be the same workout year after year. It could have 2, 3, 4, 5 year gaps between when that repeat shows up. But there was always that opportunity. And for the first time ever this year, we didn't have it.
Mm-hmm. And I would echo those sentiments, to some extent as well, because I think if you look at who this open is for, primarily, and we'll probably dive into this more as well, is you're going to have a much larger percentage of the community solely centered around whatever number of tests come out across the 3 weeks. And with that in mind, if that is the case, we have to look at, all right, so who is this for and why are they signing up? It's all right to test their fitness and compare themselves against what? Themselves last year, themselves the year before. What is one of the best ways to give a very concrete and specific example, down to the rep and second, for this large percentage of the community to compare themselves? And I think the repeat workout was, it was a rallying point for the community. I think a lot of people were excited. There was speculation for us for, I guess, quote unquote, I hate the word pundits, but, pundits discussing this. It was also an important talking point too, because it also provided analysis and direct comparison from one year to the next. So, and it also helped us map the progress of the community as well. For someone that's trying to look at what the baseline level of fitness is for the sport, having that data point that we can compare year to year is also a big improvement. So it's possible that, we see something repeated further down the line, or, it becomes a every other year type thing with a little bit longer check-in. But I surely hope that it's something we continue to see going forward, and that maybe this is just a reset, because I personally would be sad as well to see something like an annual repeat go by the wayside.
Sure. And something else that I think people really noticed about the programming this year is there was no specific strength test. Now, inside my gym, maybe other affiliates, some people were arguing that, the deadlift bar in 22.2 was heavy for some people. But when you're looking at a workout with 100 reps at that weight, can it really be a strength test that we're testing?
No, I mean, I would say no. And based on basically two criteria is that in the past opens, when we've had deadlifts and they've been considered heavy, the men's weight has accelerated up to 315 and even 365 pounds. This is obviously a far cry from that. And additionally, in part of CrossFit's teaching is that to be considered heavy, the rep range is generally 5 to 7 reps. Obviously, I think on average in this workout across the entirety of people who participated, there were between 60 and 70 reps of deadlifts done at that weight.
Mm-hmm. I agree with Brian here, but I think this is where we have to start to look at the reframing of how the open test plays into the greater season. And I still think we're in a bit of a transition and a transition year or years as far as sorting out and wiggling to find the proper fit for this for programming, not just in the open, but for quarterfinals, semifinals, and the games as we look at the test as a whole. And I did what any good reporter does, and I went to Reddit to see what the pulse of the community is. And I actually found some interesting comments from a username that I'm going to quote here. His name's Eagleman171. And I actually thought he made some good points here, and they echo some of the feelings that I have. And I'm going to read it for you here. He says, CrossFit HQ defines fitness as nutrition first, metabolic conditioning second, gymnastics third, and weightlifting fourth. In the first stage of a test that has 4 sections of winnowing, they're going to heavily bias metabolic conditioning, but basically a few checkpoints of you can't just be a cardio monster with no skills or strength to make the quarterfinals. That means that likely you will not get heavy Olympic lifting, more than one workout with advanced skills, or sprinty barbell power output workouts in the open anymore. Makes a few more points. But then he says, I think if you're someone that likes to sling a heavy barbell around and do the cool tricks, but doesn't love suffering through lots of burpees, dumbbell work, and moderate to light barbell cycling, the open is probably your last stop in the foreseeable future. I think that is an interesting comment from someone that is an affiliate owner, and he's also a fellow rig shaker like myself at 6'1", 240. And I think that kind of, got the wheels turning a little bit about where the open stands as its role in the greater piece of programming. I'd still like to see something slightly heavier. I thought overall the skills for the open in the broader community were more appropriate, and it still allowed some of the elites to shine. I would like to see the loading tweaked, particularly for the women, especially in this last one. And maybe we could be a touch more progressive in terms of pushing the load just slightly.
Yeah, and I even want to make a comment on that. When you looked at the women's barbells for 22.3, it was 65, 75, 85. The men's bar was 95, 115, 135. Normally the comparative is 95, 135. So it seemed like the weights for the barbells, especially relative to women, were a little bit off.
And we talked about that when we saw the prospective workout before we knew what it could be. Mm-hmm. But, Dave has a history of occasionally programming things, and we think this was Dave's programming, that where it's not exactly the loading we thought. People have been skeptical, and then lo and behold, come the end of the workout, we see that the times are very similar. And right now what we've seen on the leaderboard is actually that, maybe with the exception of Tia, the men seem to be outperforming the women on this workout despite the difference in loading. But to Eagleman's point, I think Eagleman has a great point here. And I think that this ultimately might be what people have to do, is to reframe how they understand the open, because that's what I think CrossFit is communicating by all these things that are so different from what we're used to seeing. Because for every year from 2013 until last year, we had a heavy implement, and this year we do not. And so they are deviating towards more of what Eagleman is suggesting by the programming this year. It basically just leaves a big question mark. Is this something that's going to become the new norm, or will they go back to a heavy implement in some form or another in the open next year or the year after?
And when you take a step back and actually look at the last 3 years in particular, it looks like maybe last year was a transition point, and we're still going to include a lift towards the end of it, but you're going to have to earn it, and we're slowly siphoning and whittling down. I don't think you could have jumped from 3 to 5 last year, and the 5, 4, 3 looks a little bit more understandable when you kind of take a step back. I also think this would, assuming this is Dave's programming, and we've been led to believe that outside of some tweaks in the first week, this is largely his programming. I think that there is a theme there that still holds true in terms of earning your strength and earning your heavy barbell. In the past, you would see that within the framework of a single workout. Now it could be, hey, now you have to earn that from stage to stage, because now with fewer tests in the open, this becomes more about having a baseline level of conditioning. And then you have to earn that in order to get your heavy barbell in the quarterfinals, which also used to be regionals back in the day too.
And even to jump to that point, the big question in the room that many people have been asking is 3 tests enough, especially for those athletes that maybe quarterfinals is their final stage? There may be a big chunk of people who make it through that can't even do some of the movements, especially the weights and the barbells once they get to quarterfinals. So what are your thoughts when we're looking at just 3 tests to advance to the next stage?
Brian, if you don't mind, I want to jump on this one real quick because I just wanted to lay down some parameters. So doing some preliminary run of the numbers and some of the numbers that exist out there as far as cutoff line percentage. If we're using 10% as the filtering method for quarterfinals, you look at based on the top 10% for each workout. If you finished at 10%, like the 10th percentile, whatever it may be, 90th percentile, You're getting 8 for both men and women. You're getting 8+ rounds in that first workout. You're getting through the round of 6 on the way back down in the second workout, and you're finishing that this last workout with time to spare, with at least 30 seconds to spare in both instances. And this is numbers that have been updated throughout the week. So if you take that in mind, and the fact that you don't actually have to be 90th percentile in every single workout to make quarterfinals due to attrition and the fall off of certain athletes from week to week, then you're looking at a slightly reduced, fitness level from all of these workouts to be able to make it to quarterfinals. And I would say that's still a pretty fit individual as far as classic CrossFit programming is concerned. So in that idea and that framework, with how the Open has been programmed for this year, and the potential promise of heavier loading and more diverse programming in the quarterfinals, I think that 3 tests is enough, at least, to whittle down to a 10% or a 90th percentile cohort to move forward.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point to hone in on, is what is the scope of the test? What is the objective here is twofold at this point. It's to get 10% of the people to advance to the next round. You still want to have enough skills and weights tested to make sure that the people who are getting there can actually do the workouts when they get there. But on the other hand, you want to have accessible and approachable and fun tests for the community. The interesting thing here to me is that this is part of the CrossFit Games season. And when we look back at the history of the CrossFit Games and every single iteration of a test, whether it's the Games, regionals, or the Open, quarterfinals, semifinals, whatever it's been that CrossFit has programmed, and if I'm not mistaken, the only other time that there's been 3 tests as part of an in-season event was the 2007 Games. And that was the very first test, the first in-season test, so to speak. And so now it's been 15 years or something like that, and we're going back to that. Why did they go away from it in the first place? So while I completely understand what Tommy's saying, as it checks the boxes in terms of what the Open's supposed to be on those 2 fronts, it does seem to be a backward step in that regard. We had this one time. They never went back to it until now. Why?
I think, and we've talked about this a bunch, Brian, but I think that's a little bit heavy-handed and leading into like a direct comparison, because now we have 3 more stages of competition after that 3-test stage, whereas 15 years ago there was only one, and you only had to put your name on a list, and you got a free hot dog when you finished, at the ranch, and maybe a few wobbly pops as well. So there's a big difference between what the 3 tests were accomplishing, considering I had some friends that were throwing down in the Games back then, and trust me, none of my friends are still fit enough to do that.
Well, and the cool thing is, and Bill Grunler and Chase Ingram did this on their podcast. They've assessed the programming of those 3 tests, and they said, man, if you're going to have 3 tests, this is about as good as it can get. And I don't know if that's the case with these 3 tests. I think there are better 3 tests you could have than this, but I still wouldn't disagree with what you said, that they did accomplish the task of finding the next 10% relatively effectively.
Tommy, what would you say your bottom line is to the programming of this year's Open?
For me, I physically suffered as much as I have in 3 tests as I have in I would say almost any 3 Open workouts in a long time. And this is someone that largely likes metabolic conditioning as like a foundation for my work. And I every single workout, I felt like I was having to go into that, like we use to lean into hyperbole, like that dark place to get the score that I wanted and to hit the benchmarks that I was hoping to advance. And so if I think the foundation of the Open was metabolic conditioning to set up the rest of the season, then I think that task was accomplished. And it makes me nervous going forward, because apparently I have some improvements to make.
Brian, what's your bottom line?
I think that the bottom line is that we as a community need to reframe in our minds what the Open is, because there's a lot of things that have happened this year in the Open that are, and it's not like 1 or 2 things. There's probably 5 to 8 things that are different about this year's Open than have been any of the previous iterations. And I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing, but it is something that needs to be talked about so that people can understand what the Open is in this new season format.
Tommy Marquez, Brian Friend, thank you so much for chatting about the Open. Now we're moving on to the next stage, so we'll really see more of a full scope of the programming as we keep advancing through the stages.